Hi folks, we're back with the ninth one of these masterclasses, and thankfully there's a little less to get through this time than there was last time. First up is a submission by Joonghyun Lee, hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who writes about their submission a piece called Something Something for violin and piano. I subscribed to your channel a year ago and always thank you for all the content you upload. I came across your series Composition Masterclass and I wanted to submit a piece I wrote about a month ago and to get some advice for it. So, first of all, let's listen to this thing. first thing I noticed is that your time signatures do not look right. And I'm not really critiquing the font, because the font is its own style choice. I personally wouldn't use it, the more traditional in that sense, but that's not an objective thing. It's really about the spacing and the size, which can be potentially confusing. If it doesn't change throughout much of the piece, or you're dealing with a large orchestral score where the conductor has to look at big time signatures to make sure that everything is lined up correctly, and you don't have to go poring over the score closely in order to make sure you're conducting the right time signature, sure, by all means in that instance, make big time signatures. That's not really necessary in chamber music, and when you do see it, it's generally when the meter doesn't change as often as it does here. I mean, you get into later on in this piece, you're really changing time signatures a whole bunch, and that just gets to be a lot. It makes things visually cluttered, especially in the piano. And you want things to flow really pretty easily under the eye. And considering that here you've only got 2 time signatures, where usually you just have 3, 2 and 3, just go with a normal 3. And if you are going to put them large, you see how there's pretty much as much distance between the 6 and the 8 as there between the 8 and the 6 here. You don't want that. I mean, this visually, this is what I'm talking about with the spacing. That's kind of confusing. And like these large time signatures, you do see this in the orchestral scores. You often see this in scores, especially for films, because the conductor needs to be able to conduct things pretty quickly. You're often under a really sharp time crunch in order to get everything recorded. And what I see here, the process and the practice of putting measure numbers on every measure, that's super common to film scores as well. So I'm assuming that some film scores were studied prior to this. In chamber music, you generally don't need this. It's even rare to see, say, rehearsal markings in these. Putting boxes around them is not bad, but you really just need them at the beginning of each system. Here, a 30-second note quintuplet is a very, very short span of time. And functionally, I'm not sure if you're going to hear this alignment. Like, you want this to release right on that A natural. Also, you'd have a ton of courtesy accidentals, which you just don't need in here. And you don't really continue that practice, so I just get rid of it. If you ever pay close attention to the sound of like a grand piano releasing, say you have a chord held down and release it, or the pedals held down and you release that, you're going to hear a little bit of sound at the end as the dampers re-engage and they cut the note off, which is going to probably take up that amount of time at that tempo. And speaking of the tempo, you definitely need some kind of tempo marking. I like this, but you need at least some kind of approximate metronome marking, either a range, which is fairly common. What I like to do, I may have mentioned this before, is use an approximately equal sign, which looks like a squiggly equal sign, to give the performers a sense of where to start, even if you don't have an exact sense of it should be metronomically in this particular tempo. Capriciously indicates to me that there's going to be a lot of interplay between the instruments, there's going to be a lot of rubato, and I would lean into that by putting, well, I would advise doing what I do. There's a reason that I do it. Use an approximately equal sign in this particular instance. In measure 4, I'm also seeing this use of really short note values. When it really seems here like you want a lift or a breath of some kind. And considering that you've got this fermata over the bar line here, this seems really, really picky. Like, this is going to be your breath between this gesture and that gesture. So, again, it's a weird use of really short note values, and at the end of the day, I'm not sure you're going to get a whole lot of value out of that. Also, what are these dotted slurs? Like, there are no program notes attached to this, so just put that in the, wouldn't be the program notes, it would be in the performance notes. Program notes are more for the audience to understand a piece. Performance notes are the nitty-gritty of how things are notated if things are unusual. This also seems like a typo to me. But overall, pretty good engraving practices here. The beaming is pretty consistent. Measure 5, just as a matter of cleaning things up. Considering this is 6/8, this is fine. These are fine. You may want to consider putting an eighth rest here and there. And also, I don't think you need this eighth rest. Technically, you do, because this is just one voice. But when you have a stemming or a beaming across two systems, no, not two systems, two stabs of a grand staff, like you have here, generally you don't want that, because it just kind of gets in the way. Technically, you need it, but most people don't use it. Also, your beaming is inconsistent over here. This looks like some remnant of some sort of default that in your notation software, because you see these 30-second notes are beamed properly here and here. So this just needs to be totally beamed across. What I don't get here about some of your beaming choices is why you have this lower note as an eighth note, and you have this dyad here and here, instead of simply stemming this down. So you have one continuous stream of notes in this upper voice, and then you have this eighth note and 16th note in the lower voice. Seems to me that would be a more consistent practice. The practice of this is fine, and this is also fine, but this is inconsistent in that you do need a 16th rest here, and a 16th rest there, and an 8th rest there. To clean this up, I would definitely do what I say down here. Of course, I would follow my own advice. Why am I even saying that? But I would reconsider what you're doing here. If you clean this up down here, I don't think you have to mess with this so much, because this is still clear on what you want. But if you really want to be super picky about it, I would stem one of these notes in this lower dyad of this chord down and beam it to this. Because functionally, you are probably thinking of this upper line going to one of these lower notes. And then you could drop it out here. Because you can drop out and drop in voices if you make it clear that one is joining the other with context. Again, not totally by the book, by practice, but functionally it's not going to confuse your performers any. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. I also like the use of these conductors markings. Again, this is evidence of your score study. Probably again looking at film scores. Maybe not. That's just where you usually see a lot of these practices, and this is another one of those. And this clearly articulates what you want without having to be super picky about the beaming, and you're still picky about the beaming, which is really great. And this is a more elegant solution to this same thing. Boulez also does this sometimes. Instead of using dashed or dotted bar lines, which in the case of a 1632 bar, which is a 3-3-3-3-4 grouping, you would have to have a ton of those slicing up your measure, and that would just get in the way visually. So this is a little clearer. However, because you're so clear with the beaming, I don't think you need this at all. Like the same thing here, this makes total sense if you're trying to conduct this, if you're really wanting to get into the nitty-gritty of making sure things are lined up. If the beaming is not exactly the way you want it, say everything is beamed together, then yeah, you need that. But since everything's beamed together, it's pretty clear from context what the groupings are. And you're emphasizing the groupings, especially here, by putting so many articulation markings on this. This is almost, Ligeti etude level of number of articulation markings on this. But each one is really necessary and really clear. I'm just really being picky here, but this seems to be a little problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm not sure you're going to get a huge amount of difference between a staccato 32nd note and a staccato 16th note, especially if they're accented like this. And then this is just a little awkward, because you're really just doing an ottava bassa on one note. Cyril Scott, in a lot of his pieces, uses a really simplified notation of this. If there's one note or one chord which is supposed to be down an octave or up an octave, he'll just put bold and italicized 8 in there. And he doesn't bother with the little bracket or things like that. What I like to do instead is just 8VB. Because this, and I saw this a little bit later on, if there's so much text and a line coming out from it, sometimes it's not clear exactly where you want that to start. And just using 8VB is a really clear way of making sure that is where you want it to start. Now, going back to the note values here for a second, perhaps you might consider a staccatissimo marking. You see this a lot in Beethoven scores specifically. A lot of his piano sonatas use these for harsh effects. And that looks like a wedge. And the advantage to that is that most pianists, when they see the staccatissimo marking, are going to play it accented. The accent is built in, so you don't need to have both a staccato marking and the accent on it. You could put an extra accent on it, but then pianists might play that with even more gusto, instead of having all of these accent markings played at around the same level of velocity, which is probably what you want. Here is really interesting because for the first time in one of these pieces, as far as I can remember, we're getting into irrational time signatures, and this is a clear use of them. I want to make that clear. With the doublet brackets you've got here, it's clear what your metric modulation is. But I would still put an explanation of this in the performance notes prior to the piece. And I don't want to come across as anti-irrational time signatures, because they do have their use. But they really should only be used when you want to avoid a metric modulation for a very short period of time. It's sort of their only function, is they're a notational shorthand which is supposed to, for a very brief period of time, give the beat level to some tuplet of the overarching tempo. So there's no reason to write a piece which is just in 7/24 time. Right? That makes no sense, because you have to have these irrational time signatures. And I know it's not technically irrational because they're totally rational numbers. I get that. It's not like pi or something that Nankaro would use on one of his player piano pieces. But they're rational in the sense that you're not used to, as a performer, encountering a time signature with a denominator anything other than a perfect square. The main explanation for this is that, say you have a 24th note here, well, what is a whole note divided into 24 parts? If a half note is a whole note divided in half, and a quarter note is a whole note divided into quarters, a 24th note would be a whole note divided into 24 parts, which in this case would be a 16th note triplet. So this is a very clear and succinct way, once you get into it, and if you have a performer who is really adept at reading modern music, they're going to be able to understand this pretty intuitively. And you still include your brackets here as a clear way of notating some of the metric modulation. But how are they in practice? That's really what I'm trying to get at here, is you could understand irrational time signatures in sort of a more distant global context. But when you're actually putting them into a piece, you have to be very clear with how you deploy them. I can't say they've caught on, just because they're really kind of strange. They really should mostly be avoided unless there is no other way of succinctly expressing what you want to express. So here, you have a 24th note, so we've established that as the equivalent of a triplet at the 16th note level. And you do a good job with this. I want to make sure that's clear. But I see this 7/24 and this 6/24, and what I see here is 4 16th note triplets. So it would be a 4/8 or a 2/4 bar using these triplets, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. This leaves this on the end. This chord, though, is so different that it sounds to me like an arrival. It sounds to me like a downbeat. I would say, hey, let's move this thing over to the downbeat. And I really doubt that you're married to exactly this amount of silence. Like, if this came on the downbeat, you probably wouldn't notice it that much. And if you really wanted to, I suppose you could make this some kind of irrational measure. But functionally, I think it would be a lot better if you can notate it in a more standard time signature to just do that. And you can express the groupings and the gestures through beaming and articulation and your slurs and other things. And again, I don't want this to be some kind of like anti-irrational time signature thing, because you do actually use them well later on. But they should be avoided if you don't have to use them. I think I mentioned this before somewhere at the beginning of this series. here in measure 20, there's just this really unusual fermata. And this came into vogue sort of in the middle of the 20th century. It's a very 60s thing to do. Composers then started to become really fussy about controlling exactly like every element of their scores. So this is the heyday of, you have serialists on one hand, and you have sort of your aleatoric chance practice composers on the other, at least in the West. And this resulted in some composers being very fussy about relative lengths of fermatas. So you would have really short fermatas and longer fermatas and really long fermatas, things like that. For many reasons, it never really caught on. For one thing, trying to adjust notational practices and engraving practices over such a long period of time, when everything has become so inculcated and standardized, you don't really have a chance at making some of these new notational practices catch on. Things like irrational time signatures have been around for some time, and even then, it's hard to deploy them in a consistent way, and most performers, even performers of new music, aren't going to run across them very often. And fermatas, they're just incredibly contextual. Like, it's a contextual thing that inherently leaves its most basic function, which is how long the thing lasts, up to the performer. And making gradations on that ultimately proved kind of pointless, both from the sort of aleatoric side, where the whole point was to give the performers more control, and from the more serial, let's control everything perspective, where it would just be easier to figure out how long you wanted it and just notate that amount of rest instead of leaving empty measures with different levels of fermatas. Plus, nobody can ever remember what they were. Like, is this the long one or the short one? Who's to say? Very small thing, measure 2 when you have a beaming issue, and that a 16th note triplet should not be tied into regular 16th notes. You don't want that. So what else? Oh, the following measure here. First of all, small notes. This makes a lot of sense for piano, but for violin, I don't think I've really ever seen this. Are you thinking of this as a not really in time gesture that goes into this note here? I don't know. What really caught my eye here, this always gives me anxiety to look at, but this arpeggiated gesture here and that, how is it supposed to be aligned? It's got to be a little more clear than that. So, like, where should that fall in relation to the 16th note that's supposedly right above it? And now we're back into irrational time signature territory. And yeah, okay, they're technically not irrational. I get that. But that's just the way people describe them. I think the easiest thing to keep in mind is that when you look at the literature that uses irrational time signatures, so say Thomas Adès uses this a lot, or Ferneyhough in some of his string quartets, you usually don't see the same denominator for a long period of time. Usually one measure, maybe two measures, if there's one really necessary context for it. And that's because, again, they're just a shorthand for a very brief metric modulation. So if you're going to use them for an extended period of time, you can either renotate them like I did earlier in the prevailing tempo using tuplets, or you just do a metric modulation if you're going to stay there. So do the Elliott-Carter approach and just put a, in this case you would have triplet equals, or a chord note triplet equals triplet. Or no. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Chord note triplets. I'm going too fast. 16th note triplet here equals regular 16th note on that side. It would just be situated over the bar line here, and then you could just use a regular 5/16, 4/16, 3/16, that sort of thing. I would not advise that because you only use this for about a system and a half, and you're going back to 6/8 down here. So my solution would be just renotate this if you can in a more standard time signature, because you're consistently using the 24th note, which again is this 16th note triplet. And it's so standard that you should just beam these bars normally, and you could use other ways of denoting the context. So these first three measures, this is just one measure of 4/8. See, 1, 2, 3, 4 right here. That's 4 eighth notes. So 4/8. I would say 4/8 instead of 2/4. And then here, let's do the same thing. 1, 2, 3. So this could be a 3/8. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You could have a 4/4 measure up until here. Or what I would do is a 7/8, which would get you up to here. And the reason being, if you use a 4/8 up here and a 7/8 here and a 6/8 here, and you're coming from 6/8, you don't want to change your denominator in your time and signature any more than you absolutely have to, from an ease of reading perspective. So if you're going from 4/8 to 4/4, and then that would make this a 2/24 or a 1/12 bar before going to 6/8. And that's going to be a lot harder to read. You can cut this down so that you're using one measure here of 4/8, one measure through here of 7/8 using tuplets. And then it makes the modulation into and out of a 5/24 bar a lot easier, because you have this triplet grouping here, and then your pianist and your violinist interpret this next grouping as though it were a triplet. This in the prevailing tempo, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're back in 6/8. So you're not spending a whole lot of time out of that 6/8 world, as opposed to this solution, which you have here, which makes sense. It's just not going to be as readable, as understandable from a performer's perspective. Not really getting into it, I don't think, as much as getting out of it. So here, like, before I get too far out of this, this would be a good use of an irrational measure. I don't think you could renotate this in a way that makes sense rhythmically and wouldn't drastically alter what you want, unless you were willing to put an extra 16th here, or 24th right there. Here, I made this mistake too. Do not do this. It's just unnecessary. For one thing, it doesn't seem like you have much of a time signature here, but you don't make it clear that you're going out of a time signature. Sometimes a 0 or an X make a lot of sense, because you still have measures here. But what I'm thinking here is that, and again, I'm totally guilty of doing this, but because you have this pedal marking, this little weird collision here, but because you have this pedal marking, you do not need to notate all of these like they're being held over, because you just can't do it physically. Also, there's this weird collision here between all the slurs and your decrescendo marking. With this seems like these should be grace notes. Like, it seems like that's what you want here because of the slash, but nothing is really small here. So if you make the note, there's a way to do this in every notation software. I'm not sure which one you're using here, but there should be a way to make these look more like grace notes. And this notation here, the left hand and right hand, I'm assuming you want that changed here, like on the 30-second beamings. I'm not sure. But if you're willing to get rid of this held over stuff, which I would definitely say, even if you don't implement any of these other changes, definitely implement that because it makes it a lot easier. You can make this a bass clef up here, and then flip these such that this staff always gets the right-hand material, and this always gets the left-hand material. It's almost a tablature way of notating things. And I want to say, I've done this before, and I kind of got roasted for it by a pianist in a pretty prominent chamber music group. I'm not gonna name names, but just passing along some of that knowledge. The way you notate the extended 10/8 here is pretty good. I would say in a part, you would definitely need the piano part in this system when you make the violin part. This makes total sense. And I would say that your writing for the violin is really good, and you clearly know what you're doing. So, props to you. Also, you're getting the page turner involved. I'm sure the page turner would be very excited about that. Page turning is actually, I find it one of the most stressful things. That and watching someone play Spider Solitaire. Like, those are two things that I don't understand why it gives me so much stress and anxiety, but it does for some reason. Especially page turners, because it's supposed to be kind of in the background, and if you screw up, like at least the performers, like script is going to happen. But the page turner, oh, make me a performer any day. And I don't even like doing that. That's why I got into composing. The string writing is quite nice. You definitely have a lot of effects here that are quite nice. This makes some sense. I would just still say, get rid of the 8-VP bassa and just say 8-VP. I do like the use of the extended techniques. I would be a little skeptical of how they're going to come across in performance, because it's very easy to use extended techniques here and there just because they're extended techniques, and I think any composer who starts using them, or unconventional notational practices, whatever you want to call them, you tend to fall into a trap of wanting to use them and not thinking more holistically about how they fit into the overall sound world and the structure of the piece. To me, a lot of these sections where you're using unusual techniques seem to be interruptions of the overall flow and form and pacing of the piece, which is totally fine. But I would just ask yourself, like, how do you see these fitting into the overall scheme of the piece? And if there's a way to make that more or less clear. Because sometimes you want things to kind of be blurred around the edges, not have a strict sense of there's this and then this and then that, as when you come to constructing a form. There's some weird beaming issues here, like this should be beamed over. I'm not going to bother pointing out a lot of that. 6/12, we'll say, makes no sense as an irrational time signature. 4/12 does here, but 6/12, I mean, you notate these as two measures of like 2/4. I mean, you have the tuplet markings everywhere and everything. And for a performer who's actually used to looking at irrational time signatures, I mean, say, you've played for anyhow, then you would be used to looking at an irrational time signature, understanding that, and then playing tuplets within those, which are more complicated. So the tuplet usage here might actually work against you. Plus 6/12, and that's just 2/4. If you think of it as a fraction, that simplifies to 2/4. So, just a thought. 4/12, though, this does make a lot of sense, and your use of the brackets really works. It looks like these brackets were added manually because they do not appear to be the same size as these. But I do like that as kind of a reminder of, hey, this is what we're doing. I'm a little less certain about its use because there is this fermata here. So you could just have that as a regular 2/4 bar and have all these as 2/4. But I will let it stand because this really does sound like a downbeat to me. And I think you do want this to arrive on the downbeat. Same basic problem here in 52. But again, good use here. 5/12, total sense. 6/12, nope. I don't think you need these. For one thing, at least on my screen at this distance, it looks like they're slanted. I don't think you would want that. Technically, you do want your beaming to be consistent between everything. So your violin, the left hand, the piano are the same, and then this is sort of a cross rhythm. Because it's so small and so localized, and you're doing such a good job otherwise, I would say it's fine to keep it as it is and just get rid of that thing. What I might tell you to do is instead beam this like you beam it down here, and just express your groupings with the slurs. Because ultimately I think the slurs are going to do more to express that cross rhythm than your beaming. Maybe put little portato markings on the beginnings of these groups, perhaps. Use other contextual means to identify the groups that you want. This 3-3-2 as opposed to this 2 and 2 larger grouping down here. The notation here really intrigues me. There's a couple of immediate problems with it, I think. First of all, the retard. This is not usually how you notate these. You want just a retardando here, and then you could even use a dash to indicate up to this part in here. Otherwise, it's just particularly from context, even without that dashed line. But you seem to have two levels of dynamics here. So you have this overall diminuendo, and then you have these swells. But it's not clear to me how low or how high these swells should be. So should these be exaggerated but never go below piano? should this go back up to forte? Should it go above forte? Should it be just mezzo forte? You're going to get some of this just because the violin is a little brighter and does sound a little louder in the upper register. All instruments do. I would just put this all on one line down here. There's a reason that you usually don't see notations like this. I get kind of what you want, but if you want swells, it's just as easy to be very clear about what dynamic level you want throughout this whole thing. And then if you want to put a little note in here like, make sure the swells are more fluid or something like this. This just does seem something that even if you put it in the performance notes, it's still not going to come out the way you want. And you'd spend a lot of time trying to explain it. Fix these. That looks bad. You don't have it anywhere else. Again, it just seems like a beaming issue that stems from your notation software's defaults. Are these supposed to be repeats of the same notes or sort of indistinct? Not super sure. This looks like a 3-4 to me. See, it's 1, 2, 3. If you really wanted this as a 6-8, you would have this beam together as either a... Well, you wouldn't even have to have it beam together. You could beam it together as a 16th tied to an 8th tied to another 8th and separate the beams between here. So this would be beamed together and this would be its individual stem. Or beamed to this. Or, just put 3-4 here. As opposed to here, where it's very clear that this is one beat, one dotted quarter, and this is another dotted quarter. Really small things. Again, I'm just trying to be a little helpful, whatever I can be. Alignment here, and this looks like you just deleted something, and this is what your notation software did. It looks like you just deleted most of the bar, and that's kind of what happened to you. Overall, it does seem like you have a lot of neat ideas to play with, especially rhythmically, and you write really well for the violin. I didn't get really into the weeds with some of the extended techniques, but again, I just caution you to make sure it sounds intentional, and not like you just had this random cool idea for something that you could do and get the page turner involved. They do seem like pauses in the overarching structure. If that's what you want, I'd say lean into that more. If they're not what you want, I would say maybe integrate them more into the surrounding sections or expand them. It's going to be very difficult for them not to sound like interruptions because the rest of the piece, even though you're using some really strange rhythms in a good way, it does seem a little more like normal fare as opposed to playing inside the piano and having sort of inherently microtonal gestures of sliding up and down the strings and playing tremolos and things like that. But overall, yeah, really good work, and I'm excited to see where this goes. Next up is a brass ensemble piece, well, mostly brass, but it's kind of a small wind ensemble piece, called Bright Fanfare by Lucas Holton, who writes, "Hi, I found your channel while looking for information about Mahler. This is the first piece that I would consider mostly done. It's just under 5 minutes. My Sibelius is being weird with audio exporting, so I'm sending you the MIDI and the score separately. I'm a sophomore in high school, I've been playing trumpet for 6 years, and was introduced to composition last year. I'm hoping this could be featured on your masterclass and give me some pointers on what I can improve on. So let's take a listen to this MIDI. First up, I'm having a very difficult time even reading the score because everything is really so close together. It's so small that you get a lot of measures per system, which is a good thing. But look at all this room around the page. Like, you have room, I think, if you really wanted to squeeze 2 systems on the same page if you get rid of the margins up here. You should have a way of making the staff size bigger and making sure that you don't have collisions between the staves, because this is all over the score. And I'm not going to be here forever to point out every single instance of one of these. They're everywhere. I don't want to be mean, but frankly, this is kind of unreadable in its current state. So giving feedback on the notation, which I like to do, isn't really possible for me. I just want to, scroll in here. These should not be touching each other. Even if they're not playing, there should be a wider range between them. See, it's such a big page that you have all this room. And I would sacrifice number of measures per system you need to get more on the page, because that's going to bring you up to a larger size. Say you cut it down here, you blew that up so that you're getting your first 6 or 7 systems on the page, and then you expanded each of those, the space between each staff on there. It's going to be more readable. You're going to have more pages, but right now you're at 13 pages, and that's not a whole lot. You also need a more descriptive tempo marking. Because is this sad? Is it supposed to be stately? I mean, I know it's supposed to be bright, but what kind of adagio? I want a adagio semplice in there, because it seems really simply stated to me, at least at the beginning. Also, you should know this as a trumpeter, but this is super high for the trumpet. My goodness. Would you consider piccolo trumpet, perhaps? These gestures would work really, really well if you had multiple trumpets that were playing off of one another. Instead of just the one here, you have 2. Is there a reason you couldn't include a 3rd trumpet or a piccolo trumpet in addition to these 2 trumpets and then trade off those gestures? I just think piccolo trumpet, has a great sound, would give you a really great color here, kind of unique. It's often a Baroque instrument. It's used a lot in Baroque scores and really large orchestras. I think it should make a comeback because it really, really would work well here. It would extend your brass range significantly because in the course of this piece, your tuba doesn't go down very low. Your tuba barely goes below where the bassoon can play. And you don't have a bass clarinet, you don't have a contrabassoon. I would say just expand the range, first of all, because you don't seem to use a lot of really low-down colors. And tuba doesn't project as well as contrabassoon or bass clarinet can, or even contrabass clarinet, even though that's generally a $40,000 instrument. It's got a really unique tone color, and even though it's not the loudest thing in the world, something like a contrabassoon or a bass clarinet or a contrabass clarinet can really poke through in a way that the tuba has a hard time doing. The tuba has a more muted sound inherently, which is why tuba mutes are kind of pointless. You don't get that brassy punch with the tuba nearly as easily as you can with a trumpet or a horn or a trombone. Very curious about the introduction of the percussion here in 29 with the 16th notes. For the cymbal, is this a muted crash? Is it just a light tap with a stick? So what kind of mallet? What kind of stick? And why does it have to be a 16th note? Do you want it muted immediately? That seems like what you'd want here. You also want it pianissimo, which you're not really going to ever get with a crash. So contextually, I would say soft mallet, immediate muting. But it's not clear. I'm not a percussionist. That's what I would think contextually. But you need to make that a lot more clear. This is actually a really cool effect here in measure 41, in that you don't have all the instruments playing, but you have kind of your lower, really powerful instruments playing sort of this unison gesture very quietly. And that's really cool to have that kind of restrained power and having more light instruments above it. There is a little bit of an issue orchestrationally in that I'm not sure you're using all the instruments as well as you could. And the reason is a little complex. But just looking here, your euphonium, your two trombones, and your horn, which is obviously pitched in F, so it sounds a fifth lower, are all playing the exact same gesture. This is not going to get you anything. It's going to be hard to maintain that piano sound. It is potentially going to provide some problems with tuning. And overall, if you have multiple instruments playing the same thing, you're not going to get a unique sound. It's very rare that you can find a combination of 3 or more instruments that are playing the exact same thing that sound like a new instrument. I've talked about this on this series before, but there's something that I like to call the band sound, which is you do a lot of doubling. Which doubling is fine, but if you do a lot of it, or triple things, or in this case quadruple things, with many similar timbres, like the horn is not that far removed timbrally from the lower brass instruments, you're not going to get something that sounds unique. It's going to sound sort of generically brassy. And you might end up with some balance problems, especially because your flute here is not super high. Your clarinet, that'll come through. But mezzo forte, I would say at least forte, because this piano is not going to come out. It's probably going to be at least mezzo piano, if not mezzo forte in its own right. Your euphonium is mezzo forte, so I'm not sure why you're having these. Then your trumpets, I'm assuming both of these trumpets are going to be forte here, which means your trumpets sort of in the middle are going to be what you hear mostly, as opposed to this gesture up here. And I think this gesture up here is more interesting, because this is kind of what starts the piece. And having that as a layer of counterpoint underneath something that's new is a little more interesting to me than just using that as an accompaniment to this central figure. Overall, I would say that the writing is pretty safe. Like, you have some low piccolo stuff that I noted, and some low flute stuff occasionally. That is fine. You're not going to hear it in a large tutti. Let's see. There's an example a little bit later. Yeah, same problem with the doubling here in 73. Not only the collisions, just a lot here. But see how you have the flute, the oboe, and the clarinet all playing the same line. That is great for flute. It's great for clarinet. It's not so good for oboe. Right? Oboe above the staff starts to get pinched. It's a little restrained. There's some really good writing for oboe above the staff. Ravel uses it quite well. But it's difficult. You have to understand how difficult that is, especially rapid notes. Right? If you get above like the C, 2 ledger lines above, it's kind of really where I top out for oboe. Like, if you really want to push it, you can go a little higher. I would not recommend it. But from a purely orchestrational perspective, even if the oboe is capable of doing that, or say you include a piccolo oboe for some crazy reason, a piccolo oboe, those are very rare. I would not call for that. You still have the problem that I mentioned earlier with the band sound. Even though these are 3 very different instruments, right? You have single reed, double reed, no reed. They're high winds, and they're all going to blend together. And I don't think you want that. Whereas flute and clarinet, great combination. That's going to stand out. Oboe can do something else. Good oboe range, kind of high staff, but still on the staff. That's kind of the gold standard, the gold range for it. Oboe is a difficult instrument to write for in a lot of ways because it has a more confined register than a lot of other instruments. And also, you don't really have to worry about breathing as much because oboe players never run out of breath because of the way the instrument works. It's one of those things that you learn about in orchestration books. So definitely invest in a good orchestration book. Because I am just seeing a lot through here, a lot of tutti, especially in the brass. A lot of instruments playing a lot of the time. And that can get old after a while. With an ensemble like this, I mean, sure, it's not an orchestra, it's not a large wind ensemble. It's kind of a small wind ensemble. but you have a lot of power here. There's a lot of juice. Like, you can really blast someone with the amount of brass you have here. And it's really easy to write for all the instruments all the time, but you don't really need to do that in order to get a full sound. You can have half or three-quarters of the instruments playing, and then if you orchestrate it correctly, you can make sure all the instruments are playing, and you can hear everything, and everybody's contributing. So I'd just go through the score, and I'd ask yourself, are these notes necessary? Like, why am I doubling this? Why does this need to happen? Like, I understand if you want to double something with a trumpet if you have one trumpet muted. Have a Harmon mute and have one straight mute, perhaps. Right? That makes a lot more sense than just, oh, I want more power, I'm going to double it. Because that can make something seem a lot bigger on the page. But sometimes if you're doubling, especially the exact same instrument, there's going to be something called phase cancellation in the sound, which is going to make the sound a little bit more muted. It's not going to make it sound bigger, right? The idea behind phase cancellation, and this is seen oftentimes in a lot of electronic music, it's sometimes exploiting this, sometimes trying to avoid it, mostly trying to avoid it. But say you have a wave here, and the wave has peaks and valleys, and say you have another instrument that's playing the exact same thing, but slightly a little bit off. So if the peaks align with the other peaks, it's going to be greater, a bigger sound wave. If you look at the sound waves itself, and you could see those flying through the air. But if a peak in one coincides with a valley in the other, they're going to even out. They're going to cancel out. That's what's called phase cancellation. So Mahler, for instance, I always forget what symphony this is from, but there's this moment where he uses 4 flutes in unison. And it sounds really kind of dull and sad. And it's not any louder than one flute would be. It's because of this acoustic phenomenon. And you really have to be aware of that. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. But I would advise you to take out what you can. Because there's a lot of unnecessary doubling in here that is not going to get you anywhere with an ensemble playing it. That you're not really exploiting the amount of color you could get out of it. Also, like I mentioned before, you're generally more adventurous in the high range you are in the low range. I think a low A is the lowest you get in the tuba, which is barely below where the bassoon can go. Granted, it's not going to be the loudest if it's low, but this is why you need more instruments in the low range. There's quite a bit of snare drum, so it ends in measure 81 technically, but it starts all the way back in 29. There's a lot of snare drum. There's a lot of cymbal too, but there's also a lot of snare drum. And wind ensemble pieces, I think, fall prey to this sometimes. Some orchestral pieces do. So the things that I think of are, I don't really count bolero because that's intended to be kind of the rhythmical substructure of the whole thing. But like the wood block in John Adams' Short Ride in a Fast Machine, I have to tune that out whenever I listen to that piece. Or the tambourine in The Frozen Cathedral, which is a wind ensemble piece by John Mackey, which is a really cool piece. And both those composers use the percussion in those pieces for very specific purposes. But to my ear, those things do get a little old. So either tune them out, or you come to appreciate the composition or reason behind them. Next up is the exposition of a piano sonata by Andres Abarca, who writes, I would love to show you the exposition of my first piano sonata. It's in a very classical / early romantic style. I would be honored to be featured in your next composition masterclass. I'm from Costa Rica, I'm 19 and a beginner undergrad classical piano student, and I've been learning composition and counterpoint on my own. This is an incomplete piece. What you're going to hear is what I've been able to write just yet. I'd love your suggestions for the development section as well. First question is this. Okay, you're writing a sonata. It's very clearly inspired by the classical style. You say so yourself. But there are some inconsistencies with that style, which betray a more modern voice. Most of these are pretty good. And a lot of them I found to be my favorite parts of the exposition, things that go outside the norms of what you expect from that classical early romantic style. So let's back up a little bit more. Sonata form. It's an odd thing, actually, because composers writing these things didn't consider their first movements of these to be sonata form. They didn't consider the first movements of concertos to be a double exposition sonata form. They didn't consider the first movement of symphonies to be a sonata form. The principle behind sonata form is the idea of balance, which was a core part of the aesthetics of classicism. It's an extension of early Baroque binary forms. They came to encompass kind of this dialogue between groups, almost Hegelian, in the sense that these groups would be defined by key, almost always a unique theme, and they would be set off against one another. So your exposition would be the section where you define where these two things stand in the course of an argument. Your development section would be these two interact, and the recapitulation would be these come to an agreement, which is a synthesis of the two in a unified whole, usually by casting the second theme in the key of the first. So it's the setting up of the argument, and then the recapitulation being a resolution of those things. And that's the basic principle. It's this idea of balance. It's this Hegelian dialectic outlook. You could see it that way, but I don't want to get too philosophical. The point is that the core idea is setting multiple things up and then letting the rest of the music have those things play off of one another. And the core idea behind it, if you look at it from that long range, not looking at key areas and tendencies and sections of these different sections, you start to understand sonata form as something that's applicable to musical form beyond just sonata form. What we've been taught is a descriptivist grammar. Later on, musicologists came in, saw the same things going on, called it sonata form. And now composers, especially beginning composers or musicians who are assigned some kind of composition to write for a class, often take this descriptivist grammar and interpret it as though it's a prescriptivist grammar, like you have to fill this mold with music, which is not historically or musically justified. And looking at it from that perspective, you can write something that's fully within the classical style and actually make it more classical if you understand where they were coming from. Because they didn't think of this as being sonata form. That's not how Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven thought of these things. But of course, since you're coming at it from clearly a 21st century perspective, since I doubt you sent this from 300 years in the past, it'd be a very incredible achievement if you did. You have the ability to look back on it with a new sensibility. Beaming, you need to have a good reason to beam over the middle of a bar like this. Usually, don't do this. This is fine. You see this often. But beaming over the middle of a bar or across a bar line is extremely rare in especially this era of music. Overall, this reminds me more of Beethoven than Mozart, although it's a little more tuneful than a lot of Beethoven can be sometimes. Some of the gestures are just quite Beethovenian. It's not super Mozartian. It's kind of got this almost the Sturm und Drang thing, a style of music that was popular in the 1770s. So Haydn's Farewell Symphony, one of Mozart's handful of minor key symphonies, have sort of these Sturm und Drang elements, which often have a lot of arpeggiations, a lot of syncopations, a lot of things like diminished seventh chords to really get the sense of stress. Sturm und Drang means storm and stress. That might be something you would want to lean into here because you almost got it. This is not really fine by the classical model here. It looks fine from a gestural perspective, but it's a bunch of octaves. So this is fine in the left hand. Again, Beethoven does this. It's more common later in the Romantic era. Because in the classical era, you're still sort of throwing off the shackles of counterpoint. Counterpoint is still taught. It's kind of old-fashioned and outdated, according to a lot of people's minds, which is why even Bach was considered kind of an old fogey, and that's at the very end of the Baroque era. Octave doubling is fine, but the idea of using two voices that go in octaves is not good. It's a very subtle difference, and it's all contextual. It's all contextual. So in this case, the left hand is fine, but because you're doing the exact same thing in the right hand, you're just doing the broken octaves. If you look past the gesture, you just see quadruple octaves. So you go from this very filled out, arpeggiated sections, stepwise motion. All this is just quadruple octave stepwise motion, which is just made a little bit less clear by this gesture in the right hand, this broken octave stuff. If you really want this to be in the classical style, I would avoid this. But even if you don't, it comes across as such an inconsistent thing that I would definitely rethink this. So change some of the lower notes here. Use this to articulate more harmony. You can do a lot of passing chords through here. Do whatever you need to do. Contrary motion is great. Anything but this, really. On the other hand, this, which has a lot of similarities, is very good. Like, this perpetual motion stuff is fantastic. Between 30 and 33, it's a really great transition. And you followed up with this excellent syncopation, which, if it wasn't so scalar, I would say this would fit in quite well with the Sturm-und-Drang style, which, is more dissonant, more angular, but the practice of using syncopation like this is something of that style. So if you want to make this sound a little more classical, I would maybe amp that up. If you want to make it sound a little less classical, I would use the same principle of using things like syncopations more than just, a couple of measures here, and then a very gentle one through here in this second theme. I mean, I really like this transitionary material. From here to here, this might be the most solid part of your piece, to me. And I fear that, again, a lot of composers take this descriptivist form and take it as a prescriptivist model. And in that sense, transitionary material like this gets thrown by the wayside. This is not something that is a valid part of a section that can come back in the development. But because that view of sonata form just isn't true, and because, there's nothing that is making you write this in a classical style, I would love to see this transitionary material expanded upon in the development. Like, this is good stuff. Because it's just classical enough, but it definitely has your own mark on it. I'd love this to be expanded, perhaps if in the transition at the end of the development, back into the recapitulation. So, and this follows a very standard classical era model of, you have a minor key sonata and the second key area, it modulates to 3, the relative major, instead of 5. Which would, without mode mixtures, still be minor. So again, it's pretty standard. What this does bring to mind is the musicological idea of the topoi, which is Greek for topics. Topos is the singular there. And this is a concept that seeks to classify a lot of, we would consider them tropes today, of classical era music, in that keys had certain affiliations, rhythms had certain affiliations, and that you could imitate, home life, the hunt, the pastoral style, the sort of brilliant virtuosic keyboard playing, sort of the singing style. All these different elements of music could be very gracefully and subtly integrated into your piece. So there are some musicologists who have gone through, say, Mozart sonatas and classified not just like, the first theme is more Sturm und Drang and the second theme is more pastoral, which seems to be a little more of what you're doing here. But rather, there are different sections. The transition would be alluded to this one topos, and then the second key area would be alluding to these other two topoi. And it's worth looking up, especially if you want to write things in a more strictly classical style. And what it brings to mind here is this is almost a pastoral style. F major is the quintessential pastoral key. So Beethoven Symphony No. 6, F major. It's this, and you often have drones, which imitates the sound of the hurdy-gurdy. And you often have harmonies in sixths. So in this case, you don't have a drone, but you have harmonies in thirds, which is similar to a sixth. The problem with the thirds, though, is I think they just get old after a while. Like, especially by the time it gets to about 46 or so, I want to hear something different. In first species counterpoint, which is kind of the note against note thing you're doing here, most teachers of that, most schools of thought when it comes to first species, say that you shouldn't stick to the same imperfect consonants for more than 3 notes in a row. Because like perfect consonants is using those two of those in a row, it destroys the idea of 2 independent voices. Likewise, just using nothing but thirds for a long time, and nothing but sixths for a long time, 3, 4 notes in a row, it tends to also destroy the sense of independence between voices. So maybe you stick to the F here, maybe have this 2 different voices, have this F, E, F, but this being a half note. Then maybe you have, or instead of going to a B flat here, have this a G. So you have this stepwise motion here. Just things to think about. I do like the syncopation here and the accent on those to kind of give this weight on the second beat. That's very folk-like. A lot of folk dances have that. The triplet figuration here is very consistent with the classical style, but the gestures here and here aren't. You don't typically see incomplete triplets like this. You usually see them as complete 8th note figures. This just seems like it's kind of a transitionary material to this, which itself seems like it's a build-up to this. And this is a good ending. Oftentimes the ending of an exposition is in the brilliant topos, which is a lot of fast runs, trills. In this case, you have this written out tremolo in the left hand. Very brilliantly written for keyboard in that classical model where the pianos weren't as big and you couldn't break them, and the pianos weren't built the same level of technical proficiency as they are now, so you couldn't pull off a lot of the stuff that later Romantic composers did. Again, going back to here, not saying you have to follow the protocol of the era, but it does seem a little bit odd. Maybe just filling out these triplets with other notes. Da 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 da. Just more passing motion. That's just an idea. The chord progression into measure 57, this is a great moment, and I actually want this to be longer. I want a fermata on the downbeat, or maybe this to be a whole measure long, and then this measure can be down here as 58, but this be a rest in both hands. Because I really want you to milk this. You're going for kind of a deceptive cadence, but a deceptive cadence is moving to 6 instead of 1, which would be D minor, so where you started. In this case, you're going to flat 6, which sounds in context to be a kind of a Neapolitan to the local dominant, which would be C, which isn't really resolved correctly either. Like, you just land on it and then you let it go just as quickly. I like you landing on it. I mean, it's not really fitting in the in the style of the era, but I like it. It's a really fun moment. And it really defines this as your piece instead of writing in this older style. I would just hang on to it a lot longer. And finally, since this is an exposition, the tendency is to have the section repeated. I just don't think this flows well back into this. So I admire Schubert's writing, and he's more late classical, proto-early romantic in a lot of ways. But his ability to get from the ending of his exposition back to the beginning, he turns it around pretty quickly, and he does it quite well, I would say. So you may consider a first and second ending. So the first ending, maybe one or two measures to transition from here back to here. Then your second ending can be going into the development, or the second ending can be the entire development. I don't know, just something to consider there. But overall, I would say also good work. I would ask yourself how much you really want this to be in the classical style, and how much of it you want to be your own thing. And I would really encourage you to lean into the aspects of this that make you unique. I would encourage you to lean into, weird chord progressions like this. Find a way of including more of this kind of material, because that's what's going to differentiate this piece. Also, definitely check out some neoclassical works from the 20th century. So Prokofiev's Classical Symphony, the quintessential start down that road, because he manages to make it sound like he's updated Haydn, which is kind of what he was going for. But also, you have these elements where you can definitely tell it's Prokofiev, which is kind of cool. Like, it's a classical piece and also not a classical piece, which is interesting. Next up is the Sonatina by Patrick Tianqi Liu, if I'm saying that right, called Sonatina Introspecttivo. So Patrick writes, I've been watching your composition masterclass videos and really enjoy the insightful, informative comments, so I decided to submit one of my own miniature piano pieces. In the Sonatina I composed, I attempted to achieve a balance between late romantic sensation and a kitsch-like quality similar to that in Valentin Silvestrov's piano bagatelles. I understand that you are currently receiving a huge number of submissions. I hope that this short 1.5-page piece wouldn't be too much of a burden. Let's take a listen. First, I want to say the title gives me major Nikolai Medtner vibes, but the music less so. Which is neither here nor there. It just doesn't sound like Medtner. First, I'd pay attention to where you're putting the half notes. These really do sound like downbeats to me. I might encourage you to move these so that they are. So maybe make this a 6/4 bar fermata, fermata, eighth rest, da, da, da. This gesture can be the upbeat into that. Da, 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 da. And then it all lines up so that these half notes are on the downbeat instead of the end of two, which they shouldn't be. Like if you're going to stick with this notation, you have to make this an eighth note tied over to either a half note or a dotted quarter, if you want to preserve that. This, you can play it. It's clear what it is. It's not standard. And making sure things are standard is a lot of, I feel like, is a lot of what I end up doing here. But it's a really important thing to know. The harmonic language does end up seeming a little busy, I would say. You have a lot of gestural stuff going on here. Like there's a whole lot of da 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 da, that sort of stuff. And I really get that sense around this, especially measure 18 here. Like I want you to really stretch this out. Like make sure that we are understanding how much juice you're putting in every single chord. There's just a lot going on. And even at this tempo, we really don't have the time to absorb everything you're throwing at us harmonically. I get things are very contrapuntal, things are very gestural, and almost expressionistic, and of kind of Scriabin-esque languidity. But there is something to be said for taking your time, breaking things down, and making sure that the audience understands every moment of harmonic goodness you're putting in here. And that also, if you do it right, would give you more time to play this properly. You have a couple of pretty big stretches here, this G flat to B flat and the C to the E flat. Those are going to be very difficult, and playing this at tempo means that you're going to probably have to arpeggiate those. And if you expand this out to more measures, even across two measures, you can still maintain some of these gestures. You can elongate some of the notes. Yeah, it's very chromatic, so I appreciate your avoidance of, double sharps unless absolutely necessary. So this is a good use of one. Oftentimes I see in these pieces incorrect uses of double sharps and double flats, or E sharps or F flats, where the voice leading is just so busy that there's no good solution. And if there's no good solution, you might as well just write it in a way that's a lot easier to understand and sight read. Because look, performers are doing us a favor by playing these things in the first place. The least we can do is meet them at least somewhat halfway. Towards the end, I also want kind of a written out rallentando, if possible, or at least some breaths between gestures, because this just sounds like you're rushing to the end, almost. I know it's not written that way, but I really do want to hear space. Just a few breaths here and there. Breath markings, at least, maybe expanded so that there's, 7/4/4 measure, maybe a 2/4 and a 5/8, or a 5/4. Right, there's a lot of instances here where you could, especially right here, you could break that, then maybe have that sneak in, and then have this underneath it. Right, so everything's not happening at the same time. So that you're recontextualizing some of the motives that you're using before, but just stretching them out. So instead of hearing this and this at the same time, which you've heard before, you play this first, then maybe that after that, then you sneak that in somewhere underneath all that. Again, just an idea. There's also, I want this to be longer. I get that it's really short. I'm not getting the sonatina aspect out of it, because the sonatina typically is either a small sonata, an easy sonata considered to be for beginning students or kids, things like that. At least that's what it's become. Or there are some definitions of sonatina where it's just a standard sonata form without a development, or with a very short development. I'm not getting any sense of that here. Of course, I could ask you the same questions I asked the composer of the previous piece. How much of this do you want it to really truly be a sonatina, or just using that as part of the title? But when I say sonatina, I want to at least have some kind of contrasting middle section. Maybe using some of the same harmonic ideas, but getting away from the gestural idea, because I really do think you explored that gesture quite a bit, and if you continued that sound world, it'd be a little bit old. But there's just so much more room to really explore the idea of introspection, which I think we're all feeling these days to one extent or another. And I'm not feeling that in listening to this piece as much as I could. There are other ways to express that, and I think that's where a contrasting middle section could come in quite well. Then towards the end, you wouldn't need that great of a recapitulation. You could just use maybe this last system, but elongate it quite a bit, like I mentioned earlier. And you could have some of your gestural stuff spread out in augmentation. Maybe make the intervals twice as wide as they once were, or the standard augmentation practice, which is make everything twice as long, which is what you'd see in, a Bach fugue if he's really trying to play games there. There's just a whole lot more here for you to explore, and I don't want you to stop short of exploring everything you possibly could. Next up is a piece by Brooklyn Penkauskas. She writes, "Here's my latest work, a string trio. And this is a piece meant to be an exploration of my synesthesia, the production of a sense impression relating to one sense or part of the body by stimulation of another sense or part of the body. So for me, when I hear music, I see colors. This piece to me is a sea of color and emotion crashing upon the beach that I call my brain." Very wonderful description. Now let's take a listen. It's important to know exactly how a person's synesthesia works before diving into a piece like this. Historically, most composers have associated pitch or tonality with a certain color or hue. And that's actually a pretty common type of synesthesia, and it overlaps with perfect pitch in a lot of cases. So, when you look at a piece by Amy Beach, or Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, or Alexander Scriabin, or Olivier Messiaen, you come to it bearing in mind that its composer was influenced to some extent or another by these associations, because that's just how their brain works. You can't help but encode some of that in your music. It's a little more obvious in Scriabin or Medtner, simply because their musical languages are so much more advanced than, the more conservative, sort of traditionally romantic approach of Amy Beach or Rimsky-Korsakov. But even for non-synesthetes, their music is often described as colorful. That is for Scriabin and Messiaen. And you're not really approaching that piece with that kind of attitude. It's much more romantic in a lot of ways, which makes me think that your associations are less pitch-based and more key-center based. So I would be interested to hear exactly how you perceive the colors and how that affects the piece, because I'm not getting a good sense of that just from listening to it. Again, it's important to know that that's where you're coming from, but when I think of music composed by synesthetes, I think of things that tend to be a lot more out there harmonically. And it's harder to hear those connections in, again, going back to Amy Beach or Rimsky-Korsakov, those associations are very strong for them. So, for instance, if Rimsky's wrote a piece about the C, it would be in E, because he thought of that as blue. That's not something that we hear, but it's something that makes his musical language consistent across pieces. Here is a little bit of a problem from measure 148 to 149 here. It's a little hard to see because it does go across a page turn in this video that Brooklyn sent me. But I'm seeing gestures, especially in the cello, that are going to be super risky to pull off. And let's go back a little bit. Okay, so that's a little too far back. Okay, so you see there's this low figure in the cello in the very last measure of the very last system here. Heck, even going from the second to the third system, that's a bit of a jump because you're moving up to a new clef and playing a false harmonic. But now down here is especially going to be risky. At the very last measure, if you look at that's going to be a double stop on the C and the G strings, which itself is going to be a little bit tricky to pull off. You can definitely do that, but then, yeah, you have to fly all the way up the fingerboard to play a false third harmonic. I don't see this as being possible. Again, this is coming from a non-string player's perspective, but I've written a lot for strings. I did take a few cello lessons back in the day, so I kind of know what isn't feasible on a lot of string instruments just by extrapolating from that small amount of experience. I don't see this as really working well for you. I think the cellist is going to fake it. Either the arrival in 149 is going to be late, or they're just going to leave off something. They're going to leave off maybe the eighth note before. I would give them at least an eighth rest, if not a quarter rest, in order to pull this thing off. And maybe making those double stops, alternations between the F and the A, like bum 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 bum, yeah. So you're leaving off 2 eighth notes. And you have spots in other places where you have these big jumps down, but a lot of times those go to open strings, and that's really nice because that's a easy to pull off gesture, and it's really dramatic. Or a low note that's an open string, and you go up to something that's high that's stopped. that also works pretty well. But you're going from a low stopped note, especially a low, relatively awkward double stop, to a high note like that, it's going to be tricky to navigate, and I'm worried that your players are going to fake it. So you might as well adapt it to suit them. Finally, here's a short piece by Joseph Alvarez. Can really hear the Ravel influence. This sounds like a draft of movement from Le Tombeau de Couperin. It has that kind of ancient, but also modern, happy, but also kind of sad and wistful sound that that suit really nails that feeling of like wistfulness, which I think is really interesting. It's not really a mood that pieces often effectively go for. And you move between 3/4 and 4/4 with great purpose and great fluidity. And I've cracked this open in MuseScore, because what I'm not really a fan of here are the thirds. So like the previous Sonata exposition, it really just sticks in my ears after a while in a not good way. I'd find a way to break this up somehow. The lower notes you introduce later on, these go a long way to helping, because it does break things up. This has almost like a settee-esque accompaniment. This just, it gets a little old after a while. The spelling is also a little weird, so let's look at this. And just tracking the middle voice. So this is kind of your incomplete. If you look up here, this makes a complete 7th chord. So with an F sharp here, that's not going to be a major 7th chord, but that'd be a half diminished 7th, right? Hold on. Yeah, half diminished 7th chord. Sometimes, even nowadays, I have to check. That's why I'm not a performer as much. My sight reading skills are not as good as they possibly could be. But I'm just looking at this section here. There's no reason, if you're tracking the middle notes, to go from a C to an A sharp, because that is a diminished third, and you want to avoid diminished thirds at all costs. Also, because you have this parallel motion here, you have this diminished 4th between the middle note and the upper note. And this also makes this less clear, because this final note right here is, I guess, almost quartal in the sense. You will have a diminished 4th if you make this, let's make that B flat, let's make that an A flat. You don't want to go from an A flat to an A sharp, so make that. Then I would say maybe we also make this a flat. I know that there's an F sharp here, but this makes a whole lot more sense. The problem here is that you also have the F sharp up there. This is just exclusively looking at the bass clef. This makes a whole lot more sense, just keeping everything as a consistent spelling all the way down. How would you do? Yeah, I wouldn't make this an. You're going to have some sharps and flats coinciding. So I understand why you did the sharps, but overall, this solves more your problems than not. This is not quite right. You want to delete that, and now what you want this is the problem with, especially with MuseScore, is that if you put the clef before the note, it's going to put it after the bar line, but that's not standard. You have it. This would be the correct version of what you had, but because everything up here is already above middle C, just do that. I mean, that makes a lot more sense. That's a good shift. You usually want to have it that shifts in the middle of a bar, if you're doing a clef change, unless there's absolutely no other way to pull something off. Oops. Overall, nice work. It's a little on the short side. I get it. It's a little piece. If you want to make it longer, I would go back to Ravel. I would go to, especially Tombeau de Couperin, do a little bit of formal analysis and see what he does to extend pieces. The relationship between contrasting middle sections, things like that. This really does seem like the A section of something else. I get it's supposed to be short, but it can still be pretty short and still be the A section of something else. Finally, and this is a problem I have with most notation softwares, but it's really easy to want to cram everything onto the same page. This is not ideal for what you want. What I would suggest doing is putting in some breaks right there. See how nice and even that looks? Let's try something else. Let's try at the end of this. Even that looks a lot nicer. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oops. Yeah. This automatically looks better, just because you're making the number of measures per system more consistent. But I suppose what you could do instead is kind of go with 6 per. Then you're going to end up with some stubby stuff on the second page. It's not 6. Can I count? Answer, probably not. That also visually is maybe a little bit nicer. What you might want to do is you can put in some breaks like that. So that looks a little bit nicer. And if you wanted to, you could put a little break like that. Maybe even break that a little bit more. Maybe, and you can change this in default settings as well. This is just a quick and easy way to do it. Spread this out a little bit more so that you don't have some potential collision issues. And people see this all the time. You don't need that. You want to have your slowing downs and your tempos at the same level and the same style as your initial tempo marking. Once again, thanks to everyone who submitted a piece. This was a really fun one to do. A lot of really good stuff. I think we got into some really interesting territory with a lot of this. As a quick programming note, I do these every 4 videos, and I have a tendency to get a lot of submissions, especially like right after I post these. And I will say that I'm fine with getting more than one piece in an email from someone, but I only cover 1 piece per person per video, because this takes a lot out of me to set these things up and kind of go into it in a way that is helpful for everyone who's watching. I'm more than happy to give you a little bit of feedback on all the pieces that you send me in one email, but subsequent emails or subsequent appearances on masterclasses are really more in the realm of, do you want to take private composition lessons? Because I'm doing this, kind of giving away some knowledge for free, but I'm not in the business of people just sending me whatever and me covering everything that I get, because that's just a lot. And I would like to even cover, repeat composers, from way back when, submitting new pieces, or even look at multiple pieces by the same composer, as I've done in the past, but I'm just getting too many pieces to do that. So just word if you're going to be sending in a piece, or if you have sent in a piece and you want more advice, then you just contact me. We can set up some kind of individual lesson. It doesn't have to be a recurring thing, but yeah, for some reason my services are more in demand than I expected, which I'm very glad of in this series. But it does mean that I do have to budget my time wisely in between other projects that I'm doing, both with this channel and outside of it, in my own career, in my own life. Yeah. Never know how to end these. Toodles.